So I think we're beginning our Zoom call. For all of you who are not here but are on Zoom, we're enjoying some wonderful cookies. Thank you, Peter, for bringing cookies for us. And just it's a wonderful summer evening, so I hope all of you had some chance to be outside today. We are continuing in this 3-week series, and this is the final week in this series called My Particular Insights on the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. Just a reminder, I'm not an academic. I was also not, there are so many sides to this particular topic that I could do this for the next 12, 14, 18, 20 weeks, and we still wouldn't hit everything. So just to let you know that there are probably a lot of topics or questions that you might have that we're just not going to get to. So I just say that as a reminder. Also, someone in the chat last week asked about the, they said, when I said there were 2 separate school systems for the Arabs and for the Jewish Israelis in Israel, that's true in the public school system, but it's not true in the private school system. So just like everywhere, there are private schools. And so there are schools in Jerusalem and throughout the country that are geared towards Palestinian and Jewish children. They're intentional about forming a school where kids can mix. So somebody had said they had been to Israel and had seen a school like that, and that's true, but it was a private school. It would not have been in the public school system. So again, just when you're talking about this particular topic, and I will say it again, I'm talking about this from a very high level with lots of generalizations, because you can find an exception to almost everything I'm talking about around a particular group of people. And just like if we were to talk about what's Christian in the United States, we would have a wide variety of what that means, right? Non-denominational, Pentecostal, Catholic, Protestant. I mean, you could go on and on and on. And yet when we talk about what a Christian perspective is in this country, there's certain things that we all agree with, but there'd also be a whole lot of stuff that wouldn't be true of every single Christian when you say Christians are, and fill in the blank, right? That's true in this topic. You can't say all Israelis are this way, all Jewish Israelis are this way, or all Palestinians are this way. What you have is a broad range of perspectives and ideologies that are at work. And in fact, it's in Israel itself, that within the Jewish population, it's tremendously diverse, from secular, I mean, profoundly secular people who would say they're Jewish by ethnic origin. They really don't have a religious connection to Judaism, to people who are the ultra Orthodox. So, and everything in between that you can imagine. And political parties like left, right, center, and groups that seem like they're left and center all at the same time. I mean, so I just want to remind everybody that what I'm talking about is really the broad stroke versions of what Israeli society is about and the broad stroke versions of what Palestinian society is about. And again, you can find an exception to anything. We are not responding to people on chat because I can't do this many things at once. So if you do have a question for me, though, you can always email me and I'll try to respond. We also had a request last night. Somebody said it would be interesting to know more about what American Jews think about this whole conflict. And yes, indeed, it would be. And I just didn't have 10 weeks to give to this topic. So again, there's lots and lots of perspectives, even right here in the United States. So, but today what we're going to do is talk about the Palestinian Christian perspective and I decision, and you guys don't have to even agree that this was a good decision, but this is the way I sort of decided to organize this talk. So, and I'll explain a little bit later why I chose that perspective today. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Israeli narrative, the broad narrative that the people talk about, that sort of in Israel in general, what you would find. We talked last week about the Palestinian narrative. These are more socio-political ways that they view the historical events that happened and how they interpret them about themselves and how they interpret the other groups involved. And today, as I said, we're going to talk about the Palestinian Christian. If you're interested in catching up on any of these talks or recommending these talks, they're on our YouTube channel at Mount Washington Presbyterian Church. And the very end of this talk, there's a link. But the best way to do it is to Google Mount Washington Presbyterian YouTube, and under special events, you can find these talks. I also have put them on my Facebook. So if you want to be my friend on Facebook, you can find them there. So let's just remember, this is the part of the country or the part of the world that we're talking about, which is Israel, it goes a little bit further south on this map, but it's that these darker areas on this map that are usually what we're talking about in contention. The middle part is what I've been affectionately calling the kidney bean, is the West Bank. And for all of you who've been to these talks, you now know what the West Bank refers to, the West Bank of the Jordan River, right? And you'll notice a little bit below where that M in Jerusalem is, there's a lake there. That's where the Dead Sea is. And if you were to go all the way up, travel up the line, and you see another darker tan area, you see the Sea of Galilee. And those are the two really geographical markers that define Israel's eastern border. And then Gaza, of course, is down there on the coast. That area up at the top has been annexed by Israel. That's what we affectionately call the Golan Heights. The Syrians are still not very happy that that belongs to Israel, but that's they acquired that land in the 1967 war. So let's talk about the significance of the three religions, because we're really talking today about a religious perspective on all of this, on how Palestinian Christians, so let's just look at what the other religions think. This is home to three major religions. So for the Jews, we have their first most holy site in the whole world, the location of the ancient Temple of Solomon, and then Herod's temple, which would be called the Second Temple, is usually how they refer to it. There is no third temple, but if they were to put a third temple, it would be right where the Dome of the Rock is. That's where they believe the Dome of the Rock was built. Well, there used to be a temple in Jesus' day. In 70 AD, the Romans tore it down because they got very angry with the Jews and sort of routed them. Eventually, the Christians came into that part of the land and they built a church on top of where the temple was. The Romans also put a they put a temple on top of it. When the Christians took over, they tore that down, put a church on top of it, which is an 8 octagonal sized church, which was typical of the Byzantine era. And when the Muslims came, they tore down the Christian church and put the Dome of the Rock on top of that. Okay, so that's the third most holy site in Islam. And then for Christians, Jerusalem is also the most holy site because it's where Jesus was buried and resurrected. And there's a church called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, just a few blocks from where these other sites are. And so here's just a picture. Here's a picture of the ancient Jewish temple as it would have existed maybe in Jesus' day. It's an artistic rendering. They didn't leave us the architectural plans, and gosh darn it, they didn't take a photo. So this is what best archaeology tells us the temple very likely looked like. Then this is what the temple looks like today. And what you're looking at is a plaza that's called the Western Wall Plaza. And that wall right there is the western wall of that temple platform. So above that platform where you see the Dome of the Rock, that's a platform or a big like park, that wall is holding up that platform. That platform, if you are Jewish, is called the Temple Mount, the mountain where the temple is. But if you are Muslim, it's called Haram al-Sharif. And so even the language of how you name these things matters over there. But that wall that we think of when we see the Jews all praying, what we used to call the Wailing Wall, is the western retaining wall of that temple. And this, of course, is the Dome of the Rock. This is Haram al-Sharif. So it's a huge platform. In the foreground, you probably can't really see, but you see where the green trees are? Behind those trees and towards us on this picture, that's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which holds thousands and thousands and thousands of worshipers. So when you're thinking about the recent conflict where it was their Ramadan, which is one of a high holy day in Islam, there were people praying all over this platform and the outdoor part, but also within the temple space, the mosque itself, which is just huge. And this is where often conflict happens. So the wall where the Jews praise on one of those walls of this particular platform. Does that make sense? It's really hard to understand if you haven't been there, but that's what it is. And then for the Christians, here's our church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But as Christians, we also have ties, as do all the religions, to other places in the land. So this is a picture of overlooking the Sea of Galilee from the mountain of Arbel. And so this is sort of a lookout. And the lake is bigger than this, but this particular area that you're seeing in this picture is ministry area where Jesus ministered. So there's archaeological ruins all along the waterfront there of where Jesus lived and where he ministered in Galilee. It's a saying, St. Jerome, one of our Christian saints, said in the 4th century that the land of Israel is like a 5th gospel. And for people who've been there, they really find it to be a place of deep spirituality. So you find yourself there visiting all these places, and I have never, for the hundreds of people I've gone to Israel with, everyone's moved. They're moved all by different things, but somewhere in this place they're moved. And it's in part because there's ancient roots to our faith. And when we go to these places and you walk in these places, suddenly the stories get grounded in reality. So while it's a 5th gospel for us as Christians, it also has the same kind of impact on Jews as they visit their holy places, as they go to the, for example, in the town of Hebron, the great patriarch, we have the tomb of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob, which you can visit. And on that particular site is a synagogue and a mosque right over the same tomb. They actually share a common wall. And at different times of the week and during different holy seasons, they they shut down the synagogue so Muslims can pray in their mosque there with more freedom. And the same is true of the Jews. It's a very highly contested place. But that connection to the geography and the physical space is a really big piece of all 3 of the Abrahamic religions. And it's very evident in Israel, which is why the land, this whole dispute is really around the land. There are religious claims to the land. There are historic claims to the land. There are social connections now to the land, as people have now had families and children, but the land is a really big piece of this. So I just want to remind you a little bit about history and narrative. History is more objective. It's historians trying to stay out of this and describing what's happening, although every historian is selective. But narrative is really a reminder of the story that a group tells about itself. So they're including who are the good guys and the bad guys, and it's usually quite evident who that is. We talked last week just briefly about power also plays into the nature of narrative and history, because the narrative that tends to win the day is, or that's more well known, is by the group of people who, quote, won or have the power in a particular place. And so it can shift, right? If your group has been displaced but comes back into power, your story will then become dominant. So power plays a big piece. But let's remember that religion also plays a big piece of this. So religion and theology also fuels a sense of group identity and meaning. And in this particular part of the world, religion is also everything. It's on your ID if you're an Israeli citizen. It indicates whether you are a Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew, or any other religion that you might be. And the questions and the insights that your particular religious group asks about any topic or reacts to a topic really impacts the narrative that you tell about yourself. So your religious perspective impacts how you talk about narrative. So think about our country. What was it founded on? People came from Europe, why? For religious freedom, right? So that story gets told often in a religious freedom sort of context. And who were the good guys and who were the bad guys? Well, if you were fleeing one group, they were the bad guys, right? You were oppressed and you sought your freedom and you came to the United States for religious freedom. And when we talk about our identity as Americans, we often include the freedom of religion, right? It's a very big piece of our guarantee. So the questions that were asked of those early settlers here all came about because of their story of religious persecution, and then how they framed their theology. That was not the theology of the day, right? The theology of the day was conformity, and they, stepping outside of that, needed a place to practice their religion and freedom. And so the emphasis then on the Protestants who came over to the United States was really about freedom, which also forms the basis of some of our individualism, right, that we have here, right? Everybody has the right, and then fill that in. But which religious perspective prevails is usually the same as in power. The dominant group prevails. So let me give you an example in this part of the world. If you are a Christian in this part of the world, in the Middle East, the dominant religious group that has the most number of Christians in this area are the Greek Orthodox. Now remember, the Greek Orthodox did not go through the Reformation. You could grow up in a Greek Orthodox home in the Middle East and never have heard about Martin Luther, ever. It doesn't matter. There was no protest, what the Protestant protesting against the Roman Catholic Church. The Greek Orthodox had already protested against the Catholic Church and split from the Catholic Church in 1050 or 1040, whatever the date is. They don't even care about the Reformation. So just think about it. So in this part of the world, if you were to talk to them, if you say you're a Protestant, they know what that is because they're educated people, but they have no skin in the game, right? So again, in this part, they're the dominant group. How many of you know a ton of Greek Orthodox people? Probably not that many, or know that many of what they believe or how they express their faith as Christians. And not because we're good or bad, it's just because there aren't that many in the United States, but in that part of the world, there is. And the second largest group in this region are Catholic Christians. Catholic Christians. So we have Greek Orthodox and then we have Catholics. So the two dominant groups in this area. The Protestants, they're like, and who are you? What's a Baptist? What's a Presbyterian? They kind of know the Lutherans because the Lutherans had missionary movements here, but they just kind of look and don't understand American denominationalism. It's just not something that your everyday ordinary Christian has to pay attention to. So again, what religious perspective prevails? Not good or bad, it's just whoever's dominant and the other stories don't get told. So I'm just curious, if you're thinking about the religious influence of groups in Israel, who would you imagine as the most influential group? Jews, Muslims, or Christians in Israel? Jews, right? Our little picture sort of gave you a hint, right? So big outside influence of Jews, of course, there. Muslims hardly have a voice, but that little teeny tiny picture is a picture of a Christian. They have almost zero voice in the Israeli government. There's no voting bloc, there's no Christian party in any of this. So really, you have a tremendous amount of influence. Now, I'm curious, how do you think that runs in the United States? What group do you think has the most influence on US policy towards Israel? You think Muslims do? Probably not, right? We wouldn't think Muslims have the most influence. So who is it, the Jews or the Christians? We would think it was the Jews, but it actually isn't. The evangelical Christians by far have more influence on US policy by their sheer numbers. And we're going to just watch a video on that. So Christians have the US Christians and evangelical Christians in particular have more influence on US policy than any other voting bloc in the US. And because the Jewish has a strong lobby, but they don't have the numbers. And then that little person at the end is our Muslim person. They sort of are disenfranchised in all of this. But it's not interesting that in Israel, Christians have almost no voice, but in the United States, we have the strongest voice. Now here I'm going to show you a video just to talk a little bit about this. This is from Vice, and this was a report that was done in 2014-15 when Obama was in office and John Kerry was wandering around the Middle East trying to really implement the two-state solution. So it's about 4 years old. Okay.
This may be the most important prophetic spot in the entire Bible because the final act of the book of Revelation is going to begin right here at this place. The Bible teaches that Russia, Iran, Ethiopia, Libya, Turkey, and other nations will come down under a UN flag and they will invade Israel at this particular point. Can you imagine? Thousands of tanks out here in this valley, rumbling, fighting, firing. Can you imagine jet airplanes screaming overhead? The battle is going to be fierce.
The horrific multinational fighting this preacher is describing is the Battle of Armageddon, which is supposed to happen right here, just as soon as Israel is a fully Jewish state. which is why a bunch of Christians in Texas have become the most fervent Zionists on God's green earth. While most Americans probably think that the pro-Israeli lobby is largely a Jewish thing, actually the most of its support comes from right here in the Bible Belt, where evangelical Christians overwhelmingly believe that Israel has a right to exist because God said so.
Go to the phone right now and call that number and say, yes, I'm going to stand with Israel. I'm going to bless the people of the Bible. I'm going to bless God's chosen people.
Will those of you in this audience who support the state of Israel stand to your feet and give a shout of support?
While a lot of Israel's financial support does come from Jewish wallets, there are close to 70 million evangelicals in America versus less than 14 million Jews worldwide. And given that roughly 80% of these Christians support Israel, that makes American Christians the largest pro-Israeli voting bloc in the world, about 4 times the size of the Jewish community on earth. There's a lot of money behind the Christian Zionist movement. This church behind me, Cornerstone, is one of the biggest supporters of Israel, not just among Christians, but in the world. The pastor here, John Hagee, has raised an estimated $70 million over the course of his ministry. Pastor Hagee also founded Christians United for Israel, or CUFI, which is the largest pro-Israel lobbying organization in America, even bigger than AIPAC, the organization most people assume dominates the American Israel lobby because it's the biggest Jewish one. What's dicey about CUFI is that a good deal of their money for Israel is spent on buildings and organizations in the Israeli settlements. These are massive Jewish communities built well within Palestinian territory, in violation of international law. The settlements are run by some of the most fanatical Zionists who believe the Bible entitles them to their land, and that ceding any of it back to the Palestinians would be a violation of God's law.
God gave them that land. They own that land.
While there's nothing wrong with Christians supporting Israel, the way these Christians have chosen to do so puts them firmly on one side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one that's directly opposed to the US government's official policy, and are using their massive political power and money to oppose the peace plan John Kerry is currently trying to push through. That's the two-state solution that would give the Palestinians the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and the Israelis would get the rest, hopefully ending all the violence.
So we're going to see a little bit more of this video, but the more extended video, if you're interested, is called Why Evangelicals Love Israel, and you can find it online. It's a really good report just talking about this issue. So let's just talk a little bit about Arab Palestinians, because what I just gave you was just an idea of the power of the U.S. Evangelical Christian movement. Again, most of us probably wouldn't identify as evangelical, right? Again, a diversity when we talk about U.S. Christians, we want to distinguish, but not all evangelicals would be as supportive as what we just saw of John Hagee's ministry. So again, with that 20,000 foot overlook, sort of looking at the whole survey of the land and not getting down in the details. But let's talk about what Arab Palestinian Christians. So we first need to clarify our language. Arab is not a country. It's not even an ethnic group. It's a larger group of people who identify with Arab culture. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Palestinian is a subset of Arabs who are affiliated with the region of historic Palestine, okay? And then you have Christians who are people who are followers of Jesus. And you can be an Arab by culture, a Palestinian by your affiliation with the land, and be a Christian who is a follower of Jesus. So just to remind ourselves of what Arab means in the modern day world, that yellow part, the northern part of Africa, and sort of this area of the Saudis all the way to Israel, that area is considered part of the Arab world. Just so you know, Iran, which is in that map, is not considered Arab. And if you call an Iranian person an Arab, they will jump down your throat. It's a distinctive cultural area, group of people, and this is where they live. And you can, if you were to move among those nations, there's quite a bit of diversity within them. But they still share Arabic as a common language, even though the dialects they speak may be quite different. They are more Eastern in their perspective, which means they hold a more collectivist versus an individualist understanding of sort of the world, Eastern versus Western. They're more tribal and family oriented. They share common food, literature, music, and they have a history and a geography that spans over 3,000 years. In the Bible alone, Arabs are mentioned hundreds and hundreds of times. Moses married a Midianite. That was an Arab, okay? Second chapter of Acts. When the Spirit comes down, there were Arabs in the city of Jerusalem who become Christians. So Arab predates Islam and goes back thousands of years. So at least 1,000 years before the time of Christ. But just religion in Arabs, not all Muslims are Arabs. Only a quarter of all Muslims are Arabs. Largest number of Arabs in the world are in Indonesia. Okay, the largest, the country with the highest population of Muslims in the world is Indonesia. Okay, so only a quarter of Muslims worldwide are Arabs. And not all Arabs are Muslim. Now, if you could break this down, the time of the 1948 kerfuffle in this part of the world, there were Arab Jews, because Arab refers to what? A culture. They spoke Arabic, they shared a worldview, and there were Jews throughout the Arab world. They were a very small minority. In the Arab world, the majority of Arabs are Muslim, but 6% of all Arabs are Christian. So you have Christians in Iraq, you have Christians in Syria, you have Lebanon is their form of government, splits the government responsibilities between a Christian president. The Middle East, in all parts of that part of the Middle East, have Christian Arabs as part of their populations. And why? Because historically, these were people whose faith ties back to Pentecost and have lived in this land. And they could have been Arabs and Christians, or Arabs and Jews, or Arabs and something else. When Islam comes, many are converted to Islam, but not all. So 6% of all Arabs worldwide are Christian. But here's a fact that I'm sure none of you, 63% of all the US Arabs are Christian. We have one of the highest percentages of Arab Christians in the world, or here in the United States. Many of them right here in Ohio. So, and where do you think most of those US Arabs came from? Palestine. And from this region, from Lebanon, from Palestine, from Jordan, from Syria. So but many are refugees. So anyway, Arab Palestinian Christians, let's now get back to Israel. 350,000 Arab Palestinian Christians live in Israel. When I'm talking about Israel proper, the West Bank, and in Gaza. So it's not a small number, it's not a significant number for 11 million people that live in that region. But 2% of all of Israelis are Christian, and 9% of Arab Israelis in this region, Israel, West Bank, and Gaza, are Christian. Okay, or that's in Israel. And then 1 to 2% of the West Bank and Gazans are Christian. Why did it say 8%? Oh, no. So I don't know why it says that. Anyway, it's about 2% of, I don't know why it's in there, 2% of all West Bank and Gazans are Christian, of them. I don't know why I wrote that way. Anyway, so why do we care about the perspective of the Palestinian Christians? One is that they share similar values to us. They share the common values as Christians and as our brothers and sisters in Christ. It's worth listening to their perspective, right? But they also share a religious connection with Judaism and an embedded connection with Judaism because they've shared the land with Jews for hundreds of years. Even though before 1948, the Jews were in a minority in this area, they still lived in villages side by side next to each other. And there was not the hostility that we saw eventually rise to the war that happened in 1948. But they also live there and they know the context. And so part of what they are asserting is they say, our voice has been, they've really been left out of the conversation. Who they are has been defined by other people. They haven't been heard. Their views were never articulated. They've been denied the value of their own experience and robbed of their voice and their sense of self-worth. And Munir Fashish is a Christian Palestinian who lives in the town of Berzeit. He's an academic professor trained at Harvard. And part of his assertion is that Christians in this region just were never allowed to have a voice in this fight. And he's actually kind of rallying against Christians in the West who say that the Palestinian Christians shouldn't say anything, or sadly, to some of these very extreme Christian Zionists in the US would say that the Palestinians should leave the land. They have no right to the land at all. So they should either be quiet and just go along, or they should actually leave. And so the Christian minority that's there is saying, no, we have a right to speak, and the Christian world should listen to us. So the Palestinians, when Christians are gonna critique, they're gonna critique two viewpoints because they're in a minority. So they wanna critique the Jewish Zionist viewpoint from a religious point of view, and they also wanna attack or critique the US evangelical point of view. And because they are the minority, and they're, as we talked about last week, when you're out of power, you have to sort of argue against the dominant perspective. So we're going to hear a little bit about what those perspectives are. The Jewish Zionist religious standpoint is that God promised the land of Israel to the Jews exclusively, to no other group of people, just to the Jews, unconditionally, without any condition, and eternally, forever and ever and ever. And that these are not up for grabs. These are not debatable in any sense. So from a Jewish religious point of Zionist point of view, they're only returning to the land that had already been promised to them. Okay. So it really doesn't matter who was living there before. If you're not Jewish, that puts you, we're not inclusive. It's meant to be exclusive. It's meant to be unconditional, and it's meant to be eternal. And the basis for this comes from Genesis 12. So this is where God is calling Abraham. And in that story, God says to Abraham, go from your country, which was in modern day Iraq, to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. And in all your family, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So this is considered the Abrahamic blessing, the promise that the land belongs to them. He's going to give them a great nation, and that through them, through the Jews, well, at this time, Abraham's family, they wouldn't have been called Jews then, will be blessed. Then it also goes on a few chapters later, and they're actually now in the land, and God says to Abraham, look from where you are, look north, look south, look east, look west. All the land that you see, I'll give you to you and your offspring forever. So this is considered the basis of the biblical promise that religious Zionism and also that evangelical Christians also place as a foundation verse. God says, go and walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I'm giving it to you. So this is the promise. Who's he giving it to? Exclusively to Abraham's descendants. Unconditionally, I'm giving it to you. Do you see any tradition on that? No, there's no condition. And I'm giving it to you forever. So that means it doesn't matter what happens in all of history, the land belongs to the Jews. Now, the Christians and others begin to say, so when you say that, what exactly are the borders that we're talking about? Because Abraham certainly didn't walk all the borders, and throughout the biblical record, the borders of Israel changed. This is the largest border, which is from the Euphrates to the Nile, which is also promised to the Jews. And you can see how far into Saudi Arabia it goes. So if you were to read one reading, all of that is how the Bible defines Israel. It looks nothing like the current modern borders of Israel. And there are some in Israel, I wouldn't say this is asserted widely, but there are some who believe that Greater Israel, is what this map shows, is actually the land that's promised to Israel. And there are some, the most radicalized, who would say, Israel is entitled to all of this land. It should eventually take over all of this land. So Christian Palestinians who are very good Bible scholars, they tend to be very conservative and very passionate about their faith and the reading of the Bible, say, so what are the biblical borders there? Can we define them, please? Then if you say, okay, well, maybe that's just too exaggerated, it was really never that. How about the 12 tribes? Let's talk about where the 12 tribes of Jacob's offspring were given when they went into the land. And this is the map. You'll notice our two geographical middle points, right? You see the Dead Sea in the bottom of this picture, and up towards the top, you see the Sea of Galilee. That's the Jordan River that goes there. But you can see how these lines, that there are 12 tribes that extend into modern day Syria and into modern day Jordan. So is that what should be modern day Israel then? Because this is the biblical promise of the land. If we were to look at Joshua, what's the border? And then there comes this little thing of, well, who exactly are the people of Israel? When we use that word and we use it, we mean all sorts of things, but the Bible also uses it, means a whole lot of stuff. You'll remember Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So everybody that descended from Jacob, they were called the people of Israel. They were Jacob's kids, right? Or Jacob's tribe, his extended family. But then there are places in Joshua, for example, where Jacob's tribe is considered Israel, but it excluded some of the families of the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh. So is it all of Jacob's family or is it none? Or is it, in another story in Judges, it says it's all of those people, but this time it excludes Benjamin. So who exactly are these people of Israel that we're talking about? And then if you go further in your biblical studies, you get a little further, you know that the United Kingdom under David and Solomon was called Israel. That was called the people of Israel. But then remember, they get into a civil war with each other and they split. And the Northern Kingdom, which becomes the kingdom of the Samaritans, is called Israel, while the South is called Judah. So does that mean only now the North are the people who are Israel? And that would be problematic for modern day Jews because it's the Southern Kingdom of Judah that has their capital in Jerusalem, that when they come back from the exile for the first time are called Jews. Judah, they were called the Judah, right? And which was shortened to Jews. Jews were not a name that was used until the post-exile, but it only referred to the returnees from Babylon who were from the Southern Kingdom, who were never called Israel. They were only called Judah. And modern day Jews descend from that group of people. The Northern group that was called Israel in many of the prophetic literature are the only group of the Samaritans, which are under 1,000 people still living today. So which group of people does this mean? And then we have this piece where in the Bible, as we get into the prophetic literature, we have the Israel sort of begins this idea of exclusive and inclusive Judaism. And you'll remember that what happens is when they go into exile and people start intermarrying with all the people, there's a time where Israel is an inclusive community where if you marry into this tribe and you become a believer, a faithful follower, you're considered an Israelite or a faithful follower. But then there was a time when they came back out of exile, and in Ezra and Nehemiah, they insisted on no intermarriage, and you had to ethnically prove you were a Jew. And they kicked the Gentiles out. If you remember, some of you have been reading the Old Testament with me, it was a pretty harsh thing when they said, even if you married and have children, send them out, send them away, they're not true Jews. So is it an inclusive or is it an exclusive understanding? That's my phone, sorry guys. It's my grandkids calling, should I take it? So in this inclusive view of Judaism that is now in tension with exclusive, obedience to Yahweh is the determination of whether or not you are a faithful Jew, not biology. And there's tremendous number of verses that speak about actually God turning God's back on Israel because of their corrupt worship practices and their injustice. So who are these people of Israel? Who are these people of Israel then? How are we going to define them? And in the New Testament, when we talk about the people of Israel, are we talking about the 12 tribes in Matthew 19? It's where Jesus says, remember, all you 12 disciples are going to sit on the 12 thrones to represent the 12 tribes. Okay, so that would be the northern and the southern kingdom, and those kingdoms that got disenfranchised. So Jesus seems to be referring to a collective group of people of much more inclusive than what they would have seen in the era of Jesus' day. They also talk about the people of Israel are the Jews in Jerusalem during Acts. There's a whole number of people that are called Jews. But then Paul confuses this when he talks about spiritual Israel, who the true people are of faith. So again, the Christians are saying so when we talk about the land, what are we talking about when we're talking about the land? Let's be really clear, because we're just using these words without definition as they would say, to oppress another people. And then we're talking about a privilege to a group of people that are ethnically Jewish, and they're using the Bible to make that claim, but who exactly are they? Because the Bible defines this group of people in a variety of different ways. So these are other ideas of how Jews are referred to in the New Testament. Jews don't accept Jesus, and in John in particular, Gospel of John, just really vicious language towards the Jews, very hard to read as someone who was a Jewish person. It can also refer to the Jewish leadership. Doesn't mean all Jews, just the Jews that were in leadership at the time. Can mean a Jew can be a convert to Judaism, a Jew can be a follower of Jesus, and a Jew can be anyone whose heart is turned towards God. So again, from a Christian point of view, how are we going to define these folks? So the specifics of the critique of the Palestinian Christians of Zionism is the land belongs to God. And God can do whatever God wants to do with it, but fundamentally, you know, we were all given stewardship in Genesis 1 of the whole entire earth. And we were called, when we were given that land to steward, there were certain responsibilities that were given. And so the land belongs to God, not to a specific group of people anymore. In part, they say this because the borders of the land are not well defined. And really in the Bible, the land really ended up meaning just where people lived. It was not always based on geography. And the people that they were defining was not defined consistently. And in the critique of what God has for this people, usually is affirming of people who were more obedient to God. It was a spiritual category of obedience, not of biology. And so if you read the prophetic literature, you see that obedience was really related to justice. Their obedience to God or to Yahweh was always tied, whether they were favored or not, was around their ability to not only listen and obey God's word, but how they treated the strangers in their midst. And so they also believe that Christians are grafted into that, according to Paul. So they would say, when we only define Judaism as a racial biological category, we're really missing what the Bible is actually talking about. Now, they wouldn't debate that you can't, Israel can define whoever it wants to as Jews. What they're saying is, for the sake of a religious argument, the religious argument falls apart when you base it on biology and when you base it on a claim to a land that is not defined in the Bible. And so for them, they would say Judaism does not equal the state of Israel. And they would say we really need to be really careful that biblical Judaism as described is not the same thing as a modern state. And they think there are particular dangers related to that. Where'd you go? So does that make sense before I just want to stop? Sort of what they're saying. They're saying biblical Judaism as defined in the Bible does not equal the state of Israel. And we need to be really careful when we use this religious language or overtones to make a claim for this modern state, when the Bible has not been clear. What it has been clear is about the position of the heart of the person as to whether or not they are a true follower of God, is how they live their life, and whether they serve Yahweh, heart, mind, and soul. And so to engraft an ethnic group in, regardless of whether they even from the most secular Jews to whatever, how could that possibly be in concert with a biblical understanding of what being a faithful Jew is involved? Now, the evangelical viewpoint actually holds all of that, but then they add their own, because part of it for an evangelical Christian is that in order for Jesus to come again, these are a form of Christians, dispensationalists in particular, that spend a lot of time worrying about the rapture. We already heard at the beginning of that one video we saw. The second coming and how they interpret the scriptures say out of Daniel, Ezekiel, and particularly the book of Revelation, say that the Jews must return to the land in order for Christ to come. And also, once they do come, and there's just some differences in where this is going to happen, but the Jews are going to convert back to Christ. They're either going to, at the Battle of Armageddon, they'll convert, or there's going to be a season of tribulation and they'll convert. But that the Jews, when they get back to the land, the idea is that the Jews will eventually convert to Christ. And Christ will not come again until this happens, or when Christ comes again, there'll be a massive conversion of Jews to Jesus. So part of their support of Israel has to do with the modern state of Israel brokers in this new time period where we are helping, we're getting ready for Jesus to return. And this is what makes it interesting, is because the Israeli government that spends a lot of money reaching out to evangelical Christians doesn't agree with this, but they're willing to leverage it for their own use, okay? So their staunch support for Israel, like I said, is similar to the religious Zionists. The land belongs to the Jews, but then they also assert that non-Jews then should leave the land. And I read a story at a conference. There was a group of Palestinian Christians that were all meeting, because within the area of Palestine, I do not want to suggest that all the Christians in the Holy Land all get along. They don't, just like we all don't get along. They have rip-roaring fights that have been going on for thousands of years. But they were having a conference about all this. And a woman from America asked the organizers if she could have a few minutes at the mic. And Palestinians, being hospitable, couldn't imagine how they could say no. So she got the mic and stood up in this conference of 300 pastors and said, I have a prophecy from God. All of you are evil. You have no right to be here. The thing that you could do if you're going to obey God would be to immediately pack your bags and leave the land. And the conference organizers were aghast, of course, and ushered her off the stage. But that's not an unusual perspective that Palestinian Christians hear from American Christians when they're over there. And oftentimes, if you are over there and you meet a Palestinian Christian, many of the American evangelicals don't ever meet Palestinian Christians. But if they did, this would be their argument. You have no claim to the land. If you want to be in God's will, you will leave. Or better yet, if you want to stay, then shut up and don't say anything. Just let this all happen. So you can imagine if you're a Palestinian Christian and you live there and you have historic roots there, it doesn't really fly. So they're going to argue against this viewpoint. But before you do, I want you guys to hear a little bit about that evangelical point of view. And again, this isn't all evangelicals. I come from an evangelical background, and my background is not as extreme as this, but this is not on the spectrum. This is not that far out, the perspective. This is the continuation of that report from Vice.
Another Christian Holy Land tour leader is evangelical pastor Urban Baxter, whose end-time ministries takes its flock to Israel twice a year. The focus of their tours is actually the real reason evangelicals overwhelmingly want the Jews to control all of Israel, which is the actual end times, as in Armageddon. Because, according to their interpretation of the Bible, Jewish control of the Holy Land will lead directly to the second coming of Christ.
The word Armageddon is actually two words, Har Megiddo, or hill of Megiddo. You are standing on the hill of Megiddo right now. The final act of the book of Revelation is going to begin right here at this place. And when Israel's about to be defeated, the Bible tells us that Jesus Christ himself will intervene. It says it this way: the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God. He is going to defeat the Antichrist. He's going to defeat the false prophet. Both of them will be cast alive into the lake of fire. At that time, Satan is going to be bound for the next 1,000 years, and we are going to crown Jesus Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Quickly, I will take time for a few questions.
What will be happening in Maryland at that time?
Well, I can't tell you for sure if Maryland will still be there or not.
In addition to Armageddon, Pastor Baxter's End Times tour hits all the other local attractions associated with the apocalypse, including the most contested piece of real estate on the planet, Jerusalem, which houses some of the most sacred sites for Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. It's also where Jesus lands at the grand finale of the end times, which doesn't pan out so great for the Jews.
2/3 of Israel will die. It's Zechariah 13, I think, maybe verse 7, 8, 9, right in that area.
Yes.
That 2/3 will die. 1/3 will be brought through the fire, and that 1/3 will then turn to Messiah in mass when he comes back. And the scripture says that they will run out to him, and when they bow to worship him, Zechariah 13:6 says they're going to notice he's got wounds in his feet and in his hand. And they're going to say, "You're Jesus, oh Messiah. We've been so stubborn. We've been so proud. We've been so blind. Could you ever forgive us? And 2,000 years of blindness is going to come peeling off the Jewish mind. And those of us that have been caught up in the rapture, come with Jesus here to
Because the Christians have been raptured out.
all who are born again
Yeah.
will have been raptured. When Jesus comes, we'll be caught up to meet him in the air.
Yeah.
And then we will come with him to the Mount of Olives. And so we're going to be watching this whole panoramic thing unfold as the Jewish people turn to their Messiah. We're going to be converting people by the hundreds of thousands during this time. And it's going to be the best of times and the worst of times.
Well, it's certainly at the worst of times, if 2/3 of the Jews are going to get killed in that scenario, right? I'll just tell you, just to talk about religious narrative, in his trips, he would always go to Megiddo. You won't go to Megiddo if you go on my pilgrimage, you know, although it's an interesting place. I might point out the archaeological ruins, but because it's Presbyterians, we don't put so much emphasis on the end times. It doesn't really matter to me. Again, my religious narrative doesn't lead me to emphasize that particular piece of real estate in the same way. That doesn't mean he's right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and he's wrong. It just means our narratives are different. And as a Presbyterian, I've been there. I've been to the site of Megiddo. I just don't think it has a lot of value for the trips that I lead. I have a different emphasis for what I do. So again, I'm pointing out the diversity of Christian thought. So the critique of Palestinian Christians are, well, if we restored the state of Israel, well, why aren't the Jews all flocking to Jesus? Why isn't that, in their viewpoint, that happening? For some versions of a more dispensational understanding of faith, the Jews would be converted, and it's like, it's not happening. And then they're saying, and how can you support Israel when the state itself makes evangelism illegal? You're not allowed to share your faith. And in fact, conversion is not recognized in this part of the world. There are Messianic Jewish believers in Israel. There are about 25 congregations that are made up of Jewish Christian believers. And they can do that, but it doesn't change on their ID card to Christian. They are still Jews. And how you practice your religion can be up to you, but open evangelism is illegal. And that's true. You cannot openly evangelize as a Christian. You can't evangelize Muslims, and you can't evangelize Jews the other way around. So they're saying there's just no way that the state of Israel could equal biblical Israel, because there's some things that Jesus talks to us about, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute, what they actually assert. They also say, come on, why are you privileging Jewish Zionists over your Palestinian Christian brothers in faith? Like, come on, America. Like, can't you listen to us? We're people, we share a same faith. So why are you privileging the Zionist line and not even being willing to listen to us? They say it's cruel to insist that we should leave our historic homeland. What would you do that, right? If this were in your situation? And then they say that whatever witness we do have in the Middle East with Muslims, it is destroyed by the American evangelical pro-Israel. It's in its fanaticism. They said because Muslims in this part of the world just can't understand it, because it feels like it's so unjust. It's like your group of Christians that are your brothers and sisters over in the US are say that the injustice is worth it because of, and nothing that Israel does can ever be criticized. How is that fair when we're living under the conditions we are? And so it means that many Muslims will not listen to Christians, while they may not be allowed to actively evangelize, they do share their faith. And there are people that cross over. You know, you can't, I have a really dear friend who grew up in a village right at the base of Mount Tabor, right outside of Jerusalem, right outside of Nazareth. She is a Christian believer. She lives here now in the United States. She married a Christian Palestinian whose parents happened to be, his father was a Christian pastor. His mother was a Jew from Jerusalem. But her family has disowned her because she grew up in a Muslim home and she is married to a Christian. And so part of the reason for living in the US is because of this. So the impact of switching religions or moving from one, even though if she were to go back to Israel, she would still be considered a Muslim. It's very intense topic over there. But Christians say we can't even talk to our Islamic neighbors because of this, the American thing. So I thought it'd be interesting to hear, and this again was, this piece is a different piece. It was recorded by a Turkish outlet, news outlet. And this was recorded right after Trump moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And so this group is just asking what Christians in Bethlehem have to think. But it gives you an idea, a little flavor of how these aren't theologians, these are just ordinary shopkeepers and people in Bethlehem.
We're here in Bethlehem, home to an ancient Palestinian Christian community, to hear what they have to say about Christians in the West supporting Israel, Donald Trump's move to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and to see what life is really like here for Christians living in the occupied West Bank.
I always try to tell my child that we don't hate Israelis, but we hate what they are doing to us. My name is Marwan Harb. I'm a Christian living in Palestine, Bethlehem. When I hear that Christians in the West are helping Israel, thinking that they are helping Christians in Palestine, I think they're mistaken. Israel is who to blame. They took everything, man. They took all your life since you were a child.
There's understanding between Christians and Muslims that live here. There's a lot of differences as well.
And who care about us, the Muslim Palestinian, they care more than the Christian in the world. So our brother, they are the Palestinian Muslims, not the Christian in the world.
I tell my brothers and sisters from other nations, Christians, I tell them to support us. My name is Sandy Kumsiya. I'm a Christian Palestinian. We are here in Bethlehem. It's really sad here.
What happens to anyone who speak against the Israeli government here? If they will notice that there's someone might make a threat for them, they will come in less than 10 minutes and take them away and will be in jail.
Some of the most basic rights, human rights, are not given to us.
We have a problem with the government and the rules they set.
Freedom of movement, freedom of speech, just freedom in general, we don't have it.
And this is it, the separation barrier, also known as the apartheid wall. It separates Bethlehem and the occupied West Bank from Jerusalem, meaning that for Christians to visit their holy sites, they need to go through an Israeli checkpoint and get Israel's permission.
Basically, you're not allowed to breathe unless you take their permission.
They control how much water we get.
So we get the water like 1 day in the month. So this is a big problem. No one know about that and no one care about that.
What I think of the U.S. recognizing Israel, Jerusalem, that the capital of Israel.
هذا غلط كبير. ترامب ما له حق يعطي إسرائيل دولة.
They can't claim it the capital of China if they want. Doesn't make any difference to us.
لأنه القدس عاصمة فلسطين.
We want peace, of course we want peace, but we want a balanced peace and fair peace.
I think what you hear there is just a desire for a balanced peace is really what you'll hear from Christian theologians. And so what do Palestinian Christians assert? We talked about what they were sort of against. So what is it that they assert? They really affirm salvation for all. And in the opening chapters of Matthew, they would say, Jesus, it says, this is the book of the story of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And they acknowledge readily that Jesus was a Jew, that he was the son of Abraham, meaning that it's a universal promise that through him, from the heir of Abraham, all people will be blessed. It's a universal claim. But they also affirm that Jesus was in the line of David, in the prophetic line of the Messiah, that Jesus also has a unique role to play for the Jewish people, and that through the Davidic king and that role, there is a longing and a hope that Jews will become believers in Jesus as well. And so they believe in a salvation for all, not an exclusion at all, and believe that part of their role is to be a witness within this country. And how to do that is by sharing God's love, speaking up for justice and speaking up for peace, but doing it in a way that reflects the character of God. They would also say that there's a mandate of salvation to all to make disciples of all nations out of Matthew 28. And so they're like, absolutely, that's part of our job. I remember being up in a little town of Burkina, which is the church where the 10 lepers were in a cave and Jesus rescues them. And remember, the one leper comes back and says, thank you. Well, it's a little teeny town in the middle of a Muslim village, and there's this little church there. It's a beautiful, beautiful stone church. And in this little town of maybe there's 4,000 or 5,000 people that live in this area, and then in an agricultural area of where this village is. But there's a Christian church there. And that Christian church, it's considered the oldest church in Christendom. It goes back all the way back to the 1st century. Even because it wasn't destroyed like the Church of the Nativity was when the Persians came through in after the Byzantine era began. This is considered the oldest church in the world. And there's only like 70 people in this church. And when the very first time I ever went there, there wasn't even a priest affiliated with this Greek Orthodox church. And I remember asking him, and no one ever goes to this church because it's so off the beaten path and it's in the West Bank. And in fact, even the guides that I was with couldn't quite remember how to get there. It's so off the beaten path. Now it's become more popular and my guides all go because every time we go to this church. But this elder, this tall, thin man stands up and he shares with us a little bit about his church. And I said, well, sir, so how can we be praying for you? And he said, pray that our children won't leave. And I said, why not? And he said, because we need to maintain our witness of love here in this community. And if our children leave, there'll be no one here left to just model the love of Jesus to our Muslim neighbors. He's not trying to convert them. He just wanted to be a presence in this community. And so his concern was that our children, who like any other family are going to seek their fame and fortune in other parts of the country or other parts of the world that would be better for them. He as a Christian says, no, my responsibility is to share love with my neighbors. And I'm hoping we can maintain that witness. Now they also believe in justice for all. And they would quote Micah 6:8 and say, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. And so they would assert justice, and they're not just asserting justice for the Palestinians. The thing that makes some of the Christians in this part of the country interesting is because of their relationship with Messianic Jews that live in Israel. And what's been interesting is that in this part of this movement of doing justice, there is now an emerging movement of Christians that are taking groups to Auschwitz. In the secular or the education system of the Arab system in the West Bank, they aren't taught about the Holocaust, because the Holocaust then was the justification for why their land was taken away from them as they see it. But Christians, many Christians have said, no, we need to acknowledge the Holocaust. It was an injustice done to the Israeli people. And so again, their justice, they're certainly not going to back off what they feel is justice for the Palestinians, but they're not going to assert it without trying to listen to the narrative of the other and say it's legitimate for us to hold that. Then you can see from Luke, this is probably one of the most favored verses, especially for pastors in Nazareth, because this is where Jesus uttered this verse in the opening chapters of Luke in his first sermon, that Jesus says, I was called to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives and recover of sight to the blind, and let the oppressed go free. And so they really believe that this is part of their mandate, is to stand up for those who are oppressed. But Christians also assert there that they have to be involved in reconciliation. It's not just enough for them to say, yes, we need to be a good witness, which in their case often is passive because of the rules against active evangelism, or that we need to assert for justice. We have to be reconcilers. And they believe that they have a unique role to play between Jews in the region, who they share the same common book, unlike Islam that shares some of the same prophets and same characters, but they don't have the same value. Of course, the Quran is what's lifted up and not the book of the Old Testament, but we share that as Christians with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so they say we have a unique role that we can play. And so this is another verse that they would use in Ephesians, where Paul is saying, for Christ is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups, and this group, remember, Paul's talking about Gentiles and Jews. He's talking about this very division between this religious division, says that he's made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is the hostility between us. that Christ might create in himself one new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace. So they take this very seriously. And so there are quite a few organizations, Christian organizations, that when they are asserting this, they will always assert for justice, but they will always talk about their role as reconcilers. And there's quite a few organizations run by Christians that try to bring Jews and Palestinians together. And they also believe this with Islam, that this is also a role that they play within the Christian and the Islamic community there. When I talk about reconciliation, it's really important that I clarify that for most Palestinians, and when they're talking about reconciliation, are not talking about assertive punitive justice. They're talking about asserting restorative justice. Punitive justice is when you impose some sort of punishment, whether it's collective or individual, on the offender. Restorative justice is something that really was brought out and has gained far more momentum when apartheid was overrun in South Africa, but also in Rwanda, where there were these extensive groups of people where great injustice happened. And it was like, there will be no country if we insist on punitive justice, right? So they really do believe that restorative justice is what they want to do here, where you compensate the victim, you repair the harm, and you restore the relationship with an emphasis. Now, just like with any group, you're going to have a spectrum of people that are more on the punitive to restorative side, but most Palestinian Christians that I have met are very much towards relationship. And that video that we just heard, somebody saying, I teach my children not to hate Israelis, but to speak out against the injustice that we experience. And that's very common language you'll hear among Christians there. Pope John Paul II has this quote, and he said, there is no peace without justice, and no justice without forgiveness. So what on earth could justice and forgiveness look like in this country? We have just spent, 3 hours in the last couple of weeks talking about these narratives that do not overlap very easily, right? And how intractable they are. So when we look at this, the Christians there would say forgiveness eases the path to reconciliation. And there has to be a view that has to be open to forgiving another person just based on common humanity. On the other hand, if you forgive without justice happening, real reform may not happen. And you may diminish the experience of the sufferer. So think about that from an Israeli point of view. Forgiveness might ease the path to reconciliation. What do the Israelis need to forgive in this situation? There's a bucket load of history that comes. I was reading some literature, for example, that a Messianic Jew was at a conference and said, the church, even the Palestinian Christian church that's suffering, has no right to ever criticize the state of Israel because for 1800 years, the church was silent about our suffering. Where were they? And so there's history that has nothing to do with the current, but the history of the whole church that says, how can you ask us for justice or reconciliation when you won't acknowledge your own? So there's forgiveness from an Israeli point of view for history, but then there's also the issues of the threat that they live under on a regular basis. The threat that neighbors do not want them in this neighborhood, right? There's still tremendous hostility in the region towards Jews. I met a young man who comes from a very strong Syrian Christian family. He was a refugee in Lebanon when I was there 3 years ago. And he has connections, high-level connections to the Assad government in Syria. So a kid of quite a bit of privilege, but he didn't want to serve in the military, and so he fled Syria and went to Lebanon. And after almost 4 years now, he only now has just gotten a visa to go to Canada, just in the prime of his life. And couldn't go to college, couldn't do anything. In Lebanon, there's severe restrictions against refugees in that country and what they can do. But I asked him almost 4 years ago, it'll be 4 years, in fact, 4 years in about a month when I was there. I said, what are you most afraid of? Like going to another country and immigrating? And he said to me that I would have to meet a Jew. And I said, what? He said that I would meet a Jew in my schooling. He goes, I know if I go to Canada, I'll go to university and I'll have to meet Jewish people. And he said, I've been taught my whole life to hate them. So how is it, what's forgiveness look like from a Jewish Israeli standpoint? This is someone who, I mean, it's family, very prominent, lovely Christian people, but this is what's the internalized hate that's going on in this region. What does forgiveness look like for Palestinians? Well, who do they have to forgive? And could they? Part of their concern is that if they give up their rights too quickly, that there won't be true reform, or that their suffering will not be acknowledged. And on all sides, when you share your narrative with one another, this is one of the biggest challenges, is you can share it and you can have empathy, but when you're asked to validate the story of the other, and validating that comes at the cost of your own, then forgiveness and justice and reconciliation get stuck. But let's talk about justice. Justice also can ease the path of forgiveness, right? If someone's held accountable for something that you feel has been done against you, sometimes that just eases the whole tension, and then you can move forward and may be able to bring forgiveness. But justice before forgiveness is very difficult when the narratives are so different. And especially when the narratives are as hot-headed as they are in this country, and I'm not saying they're not without value or justification. Usually when you're that angry or feel that wrong, restorative justice is not the default you go to, it's punitive. And punitive justice is what leads to terrorism or oppression, right? So you can claim justice for your side, and oftentimes with that, and there's no softening of that forgiveness can bring to grease that wheel, and it often can lead to more oppression on all sides of the debate. So it's a challenging piece. This is from our current Pope. Pope Francis said this recently. Justice is properly sought out of justice is properly sought solely out of love of justice itself, out of respect for the victims, and as a means of preventing new crimes and protecting the common good. Think about that. So justice is done out of respect for the victims and as a means of preventing new crimes and protecting the common good, not as an alleged outlet for personal anger. That last part, not an outlet for personal anger, is probably one of the biggest barriers in this whole conflict. Forgiveness is precisely what enables us to pursue justice without falling into a spiral of revenge or the injustice of forgetting. So what Pope Francis is calling us to is to forgiveness and justice, but that we have to discipline ourselves against a desire for revenge or that spiral of personal anger, but that we also cannot let forgiveness lead us to forget the injustice that happened. In other words, so it won't repeat again. I love that quote. If you're interested in finding out more about the Christians in Palestine, this is a document that was written in 2009 ecumenically among Christian leaders in Palestine. It's called Kairos Palestine. And the Presbyterian Church has endorsed this and has a study guide. And here it is. If you look up Kairos Palestine and PCUSA, this will come up. But it's an extremely helpful guide for us as Presbyterians to sort of look at this issue and evaluate some of the issues. This group of ecumenical Christians, it was one of the few documents where all these Christians came together and actually agreed. But they assert for reconciliation, they assert for justice, and they assert that the occupation end. And it's a beautifully written document. I know several of the signers on it that helped create it. But the PCUSA study resource is a really good one, and I would recommend it. As you can imagine, in this narrative of the Christian narrative of what's right or wrong in this country, in this region, we all have people in our families who probably are more from that dispensational point of view that we saw, right? Some who would say, probably, if maybe in the last 2 weeks you said, wow, I went to a really interesting talk on Israeli-Palestine, as soon as you open your mouth, you got in trouble, right? Somebody started yelling at you and telling you were wrong. And So even within the Christian world, you're going to hear that. So I found this really helpful as a Presbyterian, just to sort of ground myself in sort of what my group sort of hears and thinks about this. Because the Christians I know in Palestine, very few of them were Protestants. There's a small Presbyterian church in Bethlehem, which isn't affiliated with our Presbyterian church. They're just Presbyterian by their polity, by Baraka Presbyterian Church. But the majority of Christians that I know there are Catholic or they're Greek Orthodox. There are very few Protestant churches. When our groups go, we actually do meet Palestinian Christians, and in Nazareth on Easter Sunday, we go to, when we go, we're actually there for when they celebrate Easter, which is a week later than we do here. We actually worship with a group of Baptist Christians, Arab Christians there, but they're really non-denominational. It's just a young and vibrant church. That is, if I can find the church. Last time we went to the wrong church on Easter Sunday morning. They loved us. We were just about like from here to the parking lot in the wrong spot. And I'm like, I don't know any of these people. Anyway, they were happy to welcome us to their Easter Sunday service, but it wasn't the right one. So anyway, that's another story for another day. So as we're closing up, I just want to answer a question that a lot of people have asked me in the last 2 weeks. So why don't the Christians leave? Why don't they just leave? I mean, come on, it's horrible over there. So why don't they? So there's practical reasons. The Arab countries around them are overrun by the influx of Syrian refugees right now, and they were previously overrun by the Palestinian refugees. Remember we talked about that 750 that left, and now there's millions in the region. This taxes the economy of these countries. So a country like Jordan has allowed the refugees to freely mingle with society. Lebanon, for their own economic reasons, hasn't. And still, 70 years later, Palestinian refugees still live in refugee camps. They're not allowed, and they have tremendous restrictions on jobs and education and all that kind of stuff. So where would they go? The other thing is that European and American immigration policies are not really that hot towards Arabs, even if you're Christian. So it's easy to say, like, why don't they leave? But where would they go? But America at one point was very open to welcoming Arab Palestinians, particularly Christian Arab Palestinians, which is why we have such a high percentage. But since 9/11, this has not been a country that's opened its doors to Arabs with the same wide open door policy, because there's a fear of Arabs in this country, right? They're in our narrative now often are the bad guys, right? So on a practical level, where would they go? If you're an Arab-speaking Palestinian Christian or an Arab-speaking person, you would want to go somewhere where you share that culture. That's not really possible. But I will say that Christians in this part of the world are among the most educated. They are the most educated in Palestinian society and among the most educated in the Arab sector in Israel. For those of you who've been with me, you know many of the families, most of the Christian people there send their kids to private school. And those kids, I remember having a kindergartner in perfect English ask me how many languages I spoke. And he speaks Arabic at home, goes to an English-speaking school where all his instruction is in English, and was learning, depending upon where the school is founded, they're either learning French from kindergarten or German. And by junior high, they are completely fluent in 3 languages. And many of the kids that we know, and those of you who've been with me that know the families I know the world, their children are fluent by 1st grade in English. All of their instructions in English. So, and why do they do this? Because if they had the opportunity to immigrate, their children would have a leg up, right? Highly, highly educated. But these are all in private Christian schools, not in the public schools in the West Bank. But they also have religious reasons. They're very big concern that the Holy Land, if the Christians all leave, there will be no more living congregations in cities like Nazareth or in Bethlehem. And like this little church I told you about in Burkina, they say if we're not here, these churches all turn into shrines. Really, we who have had a continuous presence in the Holy Land feel a responsibility to stay in the Holy Land. And if you've been on some of these sites, which much of the tourism in Israel, you dot yourself and you're going to all these places, you're not actually seeing the local Christian population at all. You're just going to an archaeological site where some group has built a church over it, but there's nobody worshiping there on a Sunday. So the Christians that are there say we want to be here. We don't want to turn every church into a shrine. So for example, the church in Nazareth, the Catholic Church, the Basilica of the Annunciation, where they believe Mary received the word from the angel about her being impregnated with Jesus. That's an active Catholic congregation, right? And if you were to go on a Sunday morning, you would see the Mass being held. In Bethlehem, the Church of the Nativity, St. Catherine's, is an active congregation. I'll never forget one of our guides on one of our trips. He couldn't be with us on a Sunday morning because his daughter was having her first communion in a Catholic church. He was married in that church. These are active congregations. If they all leave, what will be left of them? We've also talked about the witness in the bridge building, but they also feel somewhat of an obligation to correct what they believe is incorrect biblical interpretation about this whole place. They just think the Bible being used to justify the occupation or the injustice that they have is wrong. And if they aren't there to talk to other Christians, who else is going to champion this cause? And they just believe the interpretation being used by many American evangelicals to justify the state of Israel is just poor biblical scholarship. And so they said, if it's not us, who's going to take up this charge? And of course, they have skin in the game. I think I talked about Kairos. So I just want to talk about this picture right here. This is a picture I took at church probably 9 years ago. This is a German Lutheran church. This is Ashraf Tanos, who is newly ordained to the evangelical German church in Beit Zahor. They have a wonderful, wonderful population. And this is a picture of this baby being baptized. And it was very moving to be there because it's a tradition in their, in part of their ways is that at the 40-day mark, at the same time that Mary and Joseph would have brought Jesus to the temple, it's traditional for the family to show up at church. And the woman, it's the first time she's ever back to church after her baby is born. And it's a really big deal. So they bring the baby in, and in some traditions, they dedicate the baby. And in other traditions, they actually baptize the baby at this 40-day mark. And it was so amazing watching this young couple have their first child baptized. But what I took this picture was because this baby was passed along among everybody at coffee hour. For the hour that followed, I thought, frankly, that this kid was related to everybody in the village. Well, that could have been true too, now that I know what I know. But just everybody loved on this baby. And I got talking to Ashraf after the service, and he said, really, we take so seriously that the child belongs to us. This is a little boy, and we know what his life is going to be like under the occupation. But there's a lot of years between right now and when he'll become aware of the injustices that any boy will know growing up in Beit Zahor. He said, until then, we want this little one to know that he's loved unconditionally. And I was just stunned. I mean, it was like taking the vows of baptism so seriously. And without any kind of hesitancy on the mom's part, and the parents were just delighted to have this baby. And he said, it's the responsibility of all of us. And he said, and we take it so seriously that he will know the love of God. In the society, he will probably feel less than at some point in his life. But if we can let him know that he is created in the image of God and loved unconditionally by God, that's the only thing that will be the barrier against hatred, is if we invest in his life. And I just never forgot that. It was extremely powerful, and they take it so seriously. And if you watch Palestinian families and how they treat their children, it's true. They know that they will eventually understand and see themselves as the people who are occupied. They can't stop that assault coming. Even a dear friend of mine, little George, who's all of 9 years old, in this last conflict, has begun talking to his father about knowing he's different and that there's a wall and he doesn't have the same life as some of his classmates who are from Jerusalem that crossed the wall to go to his Christian school. But up until just recently, George had no idea. He just knew he was a beloved member of his family. And he knew he was loved, and he knows he's loved by God. And frankly, he knows he's loved by God because these crazy Americans come and visit their place and tell them that we love them and that we have assured George and his family, his sister, his other siblings, that we haven't forgotten them. And so that sharing of that bond as Christians, and I would say even for non-Christian kids over there, is so powerful for them to know they aren't forgotten, to know that they are loved, and we're part of that story too. So that's all I've got on this Christian-Palestinian perspective. I'm sure you guys have questions, but for the sake of the recording, I'm going to stop that and say if those of you who are online want to write me or talk to me about this, you're welcome to. Just a reminder that the talk is on our website, or this is the link. I'm sure you all just are going to write down all those numbers. All you have to do is look up Mount Washington Presbyterian Church YouTube and go under the special events tab. And you are free to share it. You are free to watch it. You are free to disagree with me on it. As I said at the very beginning, this was just an attempt on my part to share some of my insights as someone who loves this region. I spent a lot of time thinking and praying and being a part of the story myself in the last decade of my life. So thanks so much. I'm going to ask these guys to turn off the thing, and if you guys want to sit and chat that are here, that would be great.